Azure API Management adds to the security, resiliency, and scalability of your API backends. Now, with the introduction of the AI services like the LLM models like OpenAI, Llama, Mistral, these comes with their own constraints related typically to the usage of the API tokens. To provide solution for these constraints, the Azure API Management added new capabilities and new policies that are called GenAI Gateway. With these new features, Azure API Management makes it easier to work with LLM models by adding support for policies that will make it easier to get the usage metrics for the number of tokens, load balancing for multiple LLM models, rate limiting, load balancing, authentication, and many more. In this first video, we'll explore the feature of authentication. To see how that works, we'll go through a demonstration where we'll go to create an Azure AI services with OpenAI models that uses ChatGPT, and then we'll create an Azure API Management instance that uses the GenAI capabilities in order to add authentication to the AI services. After that, we'll use a policy that will use the managed identity in order to get an access token to access the Azure AI services. And then later, for the application to be able to connect to the AI services, it will connect through the API management and it will use the subscription key from the API management. Let's see how that works on the Azure portal. In this demonstration, we'll see how we can connect to Azure AI services from an application by using the Azure API management, where here we'll go to manage the authentication to the AI services through using a managed identity that will have the right or the required airbag access roles for the AI services, and then we'll use a policy that will get an access token from the managed identity and then pass it to the forwarded request to the AI services in order to authenticate API management to use the AI services. And from the application, in order to authenticate to the API management, we'll use an Azure API Management subscription key in order to get access to the correct API. Let's see how this works from the Azure portal. So I'll start here by creating the required resources. So we'll start first by creating the AI services. So for that, I'll go to search for AI services. And from here, I'll go to create a new AI service. So for that, we'll go through those different steps right here. So far, I need to create a resource group. Let's call this one Azure APIM OpenAI, and then let's choose a region. For my case here, I'll use the region Sweden Central, and then give a name to the AI services. Let's call it AI Services Sweden Central Demo, for example. Make sure the name is available. It's not the case for this one, so I'll add just one. And then for the pricing tier, I'll continue with standard S0. Then I'll go next to the second part, which is here to specify the network. So I'll keep using all networks. It means that my AI services are available on the internet. Note that here you can also make it available only through private endpoints. Then I'll go to review and create. Here Azure will validate the template and then you can click create. This will take a few seconds and then we can see the resource have been created successfully. So if I navigate to the resource group, I can see my AI services. So I'll navigate there and then I'll go to the Azure AI Foundry that was previously known as AI Studio, but it was renamed. So if I click there, this will take me to the Azure AI Foundry portal, where here I can work with the LLM models within this space. But here I don't have any model created yet, so I can go to create a new deployment. I can do that either from here, or I can just jump into deployments and then go to deploy a new model, so deploy base model. And then here you will get lots of models and you can choose one of them. I'll continue with the model GPT-4o, but note that you might have other models available depending on the date you are watching this video. Newer models might be released, so feel free to choose the model you want. I'll continue with GPT-4o, then confirm, and then here we choose the deployment type. So for today we have those different deployment types, either global, data zone, standard, or batch. I'll continue with global standard. That's enough for my demonstration. And note here for the deployment details, you can also go to customize those deployments. So by choosing, for example, the model version. And again, this might change depending on the date you are watching this video. You might see a new model versions. So pay attention to that. And then if I'm okay with this configuration, I'll click deploy. And instantly we can see that here the model was deployed. And here I get the target URI, which is the URL for the model, which is cognitiveservices.azure.com, and then here you can view the can use in order to connect. We'll use these data later from the Azure API Management in order to make API Management connect to the AI services. So now let's go to our resource group and let's go to create a new API Management. So I'll go to click the create button, and from here I go to look for API Management services, and then from here I'll go to create a new instance, choose the right resource group, and then choose the right region. You will inherit it from the region of the resource group, and then specify a name for your API management. So for my case here I call it APIM GenAI demo, for example, and then specify organization name and administrator email. And then here for the pricing tier for the API management, note that here you have actually multiple options, and these options differs from the features they offer. For our demonstration, we'll continue with the consumption mode because it's the cheapest one, and it contains all the features required for this demonstration. And it also will be created in just 1 or 2 minutes. For the other ones, it will take more than 20 minutes to create. So consumption is enough for us. So I'll apply that consumption, and then next, monitor. I won't enable monitoring for now, but note that you can also enable application insights, log analytics, and Defender for cloud in order to get metrics and logs from the API management. Next, for virtual network, we'll keep this as none, so it will be attached to Microsoft managed virtual network, but note that also you can attach it to your own virtual network, or you can also use private endpoint with API management. Next, for the managed identity, we keep this by default not checked, but we'll go to enable the managed identity. I'm okay with this configuration, so I'll hit review and create. Once it's accepted by Azure, then here I go to create. Once the resource is created, now we can go to the Azure API Management. So from here we can see the gateway URL for the API Management, and then next here for this demonstration we want to use the managed identity. So I need to go to enable managed identity for this API Management. So for that I'll scroll down to managed identities, and then I'll just simply use the system assigned identity by turning this to on, and then save, and in a few seconds we should see here managed identity that is enabled, and we can see here its principal ID. Then here we want to add the right airbag role, the role assignment for this managed identity to access the Azure AI services. So we can do that actually by clicking here on permissions on Azure role assignments, and then here we go to add role assignment, select a scope, but note here the scope could only be subscription resource group or some other Azure services, but we don't have a scope specific for the AI services from the Azure portal. So what you can do in this case, either you assign the role to the resource group, or simply you can go to the AI services and assign the role from the AI services right here by going to access control AIM, and then from here go to add role assignment. Search for the required role that should be called Cognitive Services OpenAI User. So that's this one here. Click next, and then we select to assign the role to a managed identity. I'll go to look for that managed identity. It's of type system assigned managed identity, so it should be right here. It's assigned to an API management, so I select API management, and here I get all my API managements, and the one I use for this demonstration is this one. I select it, and then next I select that one, and then I'll go to review and assign. The role have been added right here, so I can see it if I do role assignments, and yes, I can see it right here under Cognitive Services OpenAI Use. I can go back now to the OpenAI or to the API Management, Managed Identity, and here if I click refresh right now, then I can see the role that was added to the AI services. Great, so now this means that Azure API Management have the required API airbag role in order to access the AI services. Now I'm ready to go to add an API to my API management. So I'll go to import an API. So by clicking add API, from here I can find multiple types or kinds of different API. Those could be HTTP, GraphQL, or gRPC. We can also see here Azure OpenAI service. So if I select this one here, note here it will ask me for Azure OpenAI instance. And here it didn't find any. However, I have already actually created an AI service, but this service I've created here is of type AI services. It's not of type Azure OpenAI services. That's different. OpenAI is becoming like legacy service, and it should be replaced by AI services. So this template right here, it will support only OpenAI. Maybe in the future we will see specific template for AI services, but for now it is not there. So we can do here is that we go to use the OpenAPI spec. So this will rely on a Swagger implementation. And from here, if I switch to full, then from here, note I should either provide an OpenAPI specification URL, or I can just select a file. So what is this file, the OpenAPI specification? So that's actually a JSON file that defines the different endpoints and the different API that are exposed by the Azure OpenAI service. Those services or those definitions are available within the Azure repository called Azure REST API specs, where here you'll find lots of specs for different services. And the spec that we are looking for here is this one on this endpoint. So it's a JSON file that contains the different endpoints that could be used by OpenAI. In this spec, you need actually to change the URL of your OpenAI service. You should put the endpoint right here. This endpoint is the one from the Azure OpenAI or the AI Studio, which is this endpoint right here. So I'll copy endpoint, copy that value, and then next I'll go to change that value within the JSON file that I have downloaded on my machine. Made the change right here, save it, and then next I'll go back to the API management and I'll go to select a file from my local machine, and here I go to select the JSON file. Note that here it will use the display name and the name from the JSON file in order to fill those options right here. Next, we'll go to provide a suffix for the endpoint. So we'll use OpenAI, and then we'll go to create this API inside API management. So note here, using that Swagger file, it will import the operations. Those are the post operations to consume the API management. So earlier we have already configured a managed identity to be used by API management, but to consume the AI services or the OpenAI, you'll need to use an authentication token. So we need to configure API management to get an authentication token from the managed identity, and we can do this by configuring the policies. So I'll go here to the inbound processing, where here we have this icon for code, and I'll go to change the code of this policy. So within the inbound section, I let the base section right there, and then I'll go to add another section right here. So maybe you are wondering from where I get this code. So actually you can get it from my repository right here that is available under here on the /AI course on GitHub. And then you can find the Swagger file right here, or you can find also the policy.xml file, and here you can find this authentication and the set header sections. So let's see what this policy will do. It will manage authentication using the managed identity. So as we are using a system assigned identity, API management can use or can access directly that identity without the need to get the resource ID, and it will ask that identity to get an authentication token to connect to cognitiveservices.azure.com. It will get the access token. It will be named managed ID access token, and then that access token will be used or will be passed in the header as a variable that will be called bearer, so that when API management calls the OpenAI service, it will use that authentication token. Let's hit save. Once that's saved right here, you can view now all the settings for this API. So note that here we have subscription required is already checked. So API management now will expose that OpenAPI service through its own gateway, and it can do that either by using authentication or by omitting authentication. Best practice is that you use authentication with API management, and that authentication could be done by the subscription key. For that, we have here subscription required. It means you will need to use an API key in order to access your API from API management. By default, API management uses those values in order to specify the OCP APIM subscription key values. For simplicity, we'll just use API key for the header name and also for the query parameter name. Make that change, hit save, and now we'll go to the last part where we'll need to create ourselves a subscription key to be used by API management. To do that, I'll go here to API management subscriptions, and you will see that there is a subscription created by default for all the services, but it's a good practice to create your own subscription. Let's call this one OpenAI, for example, and then make the scope not all the API but per API, and the API we want to get access to is the Azure OpenAI Service API. Then I'll go to hit create, and then a new subscription is created right here. And if I scroll horizontally right here to view or show the hide keys, you can see here the primary key and the secondary key. I'll go to copy that primary key because I'll use it to test access to that API management. Then next here again, or it's gonna be the last part where we'll go to test access to the OpenAPI using Azure API Management. For that, I'll switch to my API, and then I'll select the operation, and then I'll go to test, make this a little smaller, and then we'll go to provide required values. So first value should be required is the deployment ID. Deployment ID should be the name of your LLM model, which is in my case that's called GPT-4o. You can find that within the deployments. So I'll copy that name, I'll use it here, and then for the API version, this should be using the 2024-10.21 API version. This also might change, pay attention to that. Then next, in the header section, we need to specify, in addition to the content type, which should be application/JSON, we need to add another header where we'll pass the API key for the API management. So we choose here API key, that's the one that we have renamed earlier, and here we'll specify the value that should be provided, which is the subscription that we have got from the subscriptions. Next, in the request body, there is an example for a request here. We'll go to delete it, and then we'll go to paste this JSON file that will contain section for messages, where we have the role for the system. The content is you are sarcastic and helpful assistant. You can put whatever you want here. And then the role of the user, he will ask, can you tell me the time, please? And then we can click send to send this request. I scroll down to see the response. Then here, yes, the request was sent successfully, and we get the code 200 OK. And the response that we have get from this LLM model is this one here. So, oh sure. And here it is, the full text of that response. And that was how you can consume Azure AI services through using Azure API Management. Thank you. Let's use Python Notebook in order to connect to the Azure API Management gateway that will connect us to the LLM model that is hosted inside Azure AI services. We have already made the test from using the Azure API Management test console right here, and we have get the response from the LLM model. For the test, we have provided the values for the deployment ID, API version, the URL for the API management, and also the API key and the JSON request. For Python notebooks, it's going to be the same input and the same method. So we need to provide the API management gateway URL. You can get that URL from the overview section right here. If I go to click here, then I should replace it with the name of my API management. And then for the subscription key, it's the one available on subscriptions here that we have created earlier. So if I just go to show, go to copy this value, and then we'll go to paste it right here. Then for the OpenAI API version, we'll use this version. And for the model name, that's the model name that we have created earlier, and it have the name GPT-4o. You can verify those details if you go to deployments. Then here you have the name of the model, or the custom name of the model, and the name of the model itself. Once we have all this required input, we'll go to click execute cell. And if you are running Python notebook for the first time, then you might get here an alert that is asking you to select an interpreter. So we'll just select Python. And if you are running Python notebooks for the first time in your VS Code, then make sure that you have installed the Jupyter extension within your VS Code right here. That's called Jupyter, and it's created by Microsoft. You just go to click install right here. Okay, so with this input, next we'll go to test the API using direct HTTP call. For that, we'll use here the requests library. This is a library that can run get, post, delete HTTP requests. So here, first we need to construct the URL for the API. So that's going to be the resource gateway URL / OpenAI deployments. And then we append the OpenAI deployment name chat completions with the API version, then we provide the API version, and then we create the message, which is the JSON request right here that contains the content from system and the content from the user. In this example, we are asking ChatGPT for the time, for example. Once that request have been sent, we can get the response. And note, when sending the request, we are also adding the API key in order to authenticate the Python Jupyter Notebook application here to the API management using the API management subscription key. Then next we parse the response. We make sure that the response is 200 OK. Once that's the case, we'll go to load the JSON file, and then we'll go to look for the content message. Let's run this code. It will take a second, and here we can get the response status 200 OK, and here we get the response from ChatGPT that have been gone through the Azure API Management. Now, if you are using the Azure OpenAI Python SDK, then that SDK will contain a method that will allow you to connect to the LLM through using API management. How to use it? So just we provide here the message, which is the JSON request right here, and then we create an instance of the class Azure OpenAI, which is part of the OpenAI library. We give it the API management gateway URL. We give it the subscription key and the OpenAPI version, and then we invoke the web service for chat.completions.create. We give it the required parameters, and then for the response, we can see the content of the message. Let's run this request, and here we can get the response from the LLM model.